In 1810, the land where HMP Perth now stands was originally bought for the Moncrief family to house French prisoners of war captured during the Napoleonic Wars. Designed by government architect Robert Reed, the depot held up to 7,000 prisoners at its peak. That's some amount of overcrowding, let me tell you. Many prisoners were confined, but others were granted unique freedoms. French officers lived with local families under parole agreements, promising not to escape. Obviously, there was a few that did try to put the boot down, but were they successful? Partially. Because although they did make it back to France, they were sent back by the French government to preserve the honour of the parole system. It's the French for you, I suppose. When the war ended in 1815, the prisoners were sent packing. After they left, the depot became a military store. But in 1839, the depot was chosen as the site for Scotland's first national prison. Modelled after Joshua Jebb's Pentonville design, the General Prison at Perth featured 4 radiating wings, each capable of housing 160 inmates. Perth Prison opened in 1842. It was a unisex jail with male and female screws running the show, and even had Scotland's most criminally insane, earning comparisons to Broadmoor Asylum. You see, Perth was Scotland's attempt to shift from the brutal regime at the Bridewells to a more modernised approach. One of the approaches the new jail included was individual cells to house the prisoners, whereas the Bridewells had men, women and even wains occupying cells imprisoned for a whole number of offences. The powers that be felt that categorising inmates based on gender and the severity of the crime would reduce moral contamination, quote unquote. And see, you're wondering what moral contamination is, right? That was a phrase used back then to describe instances where certain prisoners who might not be fully fledged criminals or might be vulnerable would be corrupted by associating with people who were involved in criminality of a more serious nature. Flying with the crows, not on top of it. The concept of moral contamination was central to the philosophy behind Perth. Reformers thought that by isolating inmates and categorising them, it would stop the spread of criminal habits and attitudes. One of the methods that Perth decided would complement rehabilitation was solitary confinement, which was enforced to promote reflection with the hopes of encouraging moral reform. We'll just lock you up in a room and have you think about it. But that's the thing, that wasn't the only method they used. Right, listen. The prison also enforced religion. The cons basically had to go to chapel, which were led by prison chaplains. The services focused on repentance, moral instruction, and the pursuit of spiritual salvation. Because of course, the problem wasn't poverty, it wasn't deprivation, or even society. It was clearly God not being about. That was it. In 1870, the jail became the site of Britain's first private execution when George Chalmers, a vagrant from Bracco, was hanged within its walls after public executions were abolished in 1868. So they stopped hanging people outside, but they just started doing it in the jails. But this wasn't the only notoriety the prison would achieve in its history. During the suffragette movement in the early 20th century, where women campaigned for the right to vote in parliamentary election, many women were arrested and even jailed for their involvement for what was seen as militant action. But upon imprisonment, the suffragettes would take on the status of political prisoners and not common criminals. And in order to highlight recognition of their cause and protest their treatment in prison, they would go on hunger strikes. So how does Perth come into it? You're probably wondering. It's because Perth was the only jail that had the facilities to force feed hunger striking suffragettes, where they get restrained, have a rubber tube shoved in their throat, and then have liquid food poured down the tube into their stomach. That's one way to get a scran in you, not on top of it. As time went on, people quickly realised that solitary confinement and religious bob-ashing techniques weren't having the desired effect. In actual fact, a lot of cons experienced depression, anxiety, and even insanity due to the lack of human interaction. Shock horror. Critics, including reformers and chaplains, started questioning whether solitary confinement was humane or effective. Joseph John Gurney, a minister and prison reformer who, in his written piece, notes in a visit made to some of the prisons in Scotland and the north of England, very catchy title, stated, "The system of solitary confinement, if too far extended, tends to undermine the mental faculties and to produce a morbid state of mind. And you want to know who else had an opinion on this? Charles Dickens. He had an opinion in solitary confinement, describing it as a form of torture. He said, "I am persuaded that those who designed this system do not know what it is that they are doing. I hold this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body." Some boy. Plus, Perth's attempts to rehabilitate offenders for committing further crimes was a complete failure, as a high percentage of people released re-offended. A quote for Caledonian Mercury in 1848 criticised Perth for its failure to reduce recidivism and claimed that as many as 2/3 of prisoners released for Perth re-offended, stating, "Despite its progressive reforms and separation system, the general prison at Perth has become a revolving door for offenders. Warmth, food and solitude, these comforts alien to the lives of the poorest, seem to encourage men to return willingly." So it seems that societal issues like poverty were still contributing to crime, and even the harshest of penal punishment wasn't enough to deter people from breaking the law. It was time for the Scottish Prison Board to return to the drawing board. Whee! Come on, niggas are laughing at that, man. Come on, geez it. You smile. But see, the ineffectiveness of Perth's rehabilitations wasn't the only problem they were up against. You see, the Industrial Revolution, which was also in the 19th century, established Glasgow as an industrial shipping hub, which meant plenty of opportunities for employment. Woohoo! But we were soon to discover Glasgow was the birthplace of a very different kind of revolution. This was an era where poverty was rife, people flocked to Glasgow, and quite quickly the population boomed. Unfortunately though, the shipping industry was unable to cope with the high volume of people coming in looking for work, which meant that the slums of Glasgow that were inhabited by the working class became overpopulated by poor, unemployed families. The problem of overcrowding strikes again. This was an environment where Glasgow gang culture was born and birthed the likes of the penny gangs. Crime rates were going through the roof. But it wasn't just the shipyards that were unable to cope with the demand. Calton Jail, Glasgow Toll Booth, North Street Prison and Duke Street Prison were the go-to jails for criminals in Glasgow. They were all over the city and they served different functions, housing debtors, petty offenders and more serious criminals awaiting trial or transportation. But these were only built to accommodate a smaller population for a period in history. Not to mention that the conditions were insanitary, to say the least, and most of them unfit for purpose. The thing is, during this period, prisons were run by local councils that were usually made up of landowners and merchants, essentially people with money. Due to the fact that councils operated the jails, they were responsible for funding, construction, maintenance, staffing and policy formation. The funding came from local taxes, so depending on the economic prosperity of the area, that would massively affect prison conditions. Let's just say a jail in Mulgai was much better than a jail in Govan. This meant there was a lot of inconsistencies throughout the country in regards to the prison system. Basically, it was an utter shambles, with the overcrowding problem putting a massive strain on an already fractured system. The Home Office decided to get in about it and would implement the Prison Scotland Act of 1877. The Act transferred the responsibility for maintaining prisons for local authorities to the Home Secretary. That was a man called Richard Ashton Cross, who happened to be a Tory. No surprise there, is it? So this meant rather than multiple councils running separate jails with different rules and funding, it would be a case of one singer, one song. This would revolutionise the Scottish prison system. One of the first ports of call was establishing the Prison Commissioners for Scotland, who was responsible for overseeing the administration, operation and regulation of prisons in Scotland. Their main function was to assist the Home Secretary, and they pretty much replaced the local councils in the management of the prison system. It's fair to say they had their work cut out for them. The population was at an all-time high, crime rates were through the roof, and suddenly they had to come up with a solution that solved multiple problems at once. This led to them making the decision to open up a new national prison for Scotland, one which would solder itself into our country's dark history. And it also played a part in my own personal history. This prison was HMP Perth. If you want to view this episode in its entirety, then head on over to the Patreon and sign up to the Pater Pro tier. For a small one-off payment, you can watch the full history of the Scottish Prison System podcast.